Thank you, everyone. We're gonna get started. It's always a special slot in the agenda between the morning and lunch, right? I'll try to make this as conversational as possible, as painless as possible, and as full of lessons and tips and tricks for anyone looking to implement DevOps and SRE inside their companies. My name is Marcelo Bellinaso. I work for Microsoft in Seattle. My team is part of Azure Engineering. And basically, we are Cloud Ops advocates. A lot of people ask, what does a Cloud Ops advocate do, right? Very similar to developer advocates, but we spend most of our time in the trenches with operations teams, IT operations teams, right? What we want to do is to really understand how IT operations communities, professionals are using Microsoft products and cloud products in general, get that feedback, get the requirements, bring those requirements back into Azure Engineering to make sure that we create a cloud platform that essentially fulfill the requirements for modern IT operations teams. So that's essentially what we do. If you want to follow our cloud advocates or our content and learn more about SRE, DevOps, and some of the modern patterns and practices for cloud, you can, our conversation, we use the hashtag AZOps on Twitter. That's probably the easiest way to follow our advocates and our content as well. Today, we're not going to talk about my team. Today, we're going to talk about this team. This is a recent picture of the LinkedIn SRE organization, okay? And you may be thinking, okay, here we go again. Another example of a company well-funded with a lot of resources that come here and tell me how easy it is to do some of these things, right? To implement DevOps, to implement SRE, to create an automated and fully functional infrastructure. This is a recent picture, right? They are in a journey. They've been in this journey for over 8 years now. And the SRE team at LinkedIn started with 0 resources, literally with 0. So we're going to go back in this presentation to the moment where the SRE team was created, what was happening inside LinkedIn, outside LinkedIn, the competitive environment outside LinkedIn, also inside the company, inside operations, inside the product owners, the product leaders, and inside the dev teams as well. And that's where we're going to pinpoint some of the lessons, some of the best practices in this journey that they've been going through, okay? We had some really good talks that touched on the topic of SRE. I don't know if Rita is here. Really great Ignite talk yesterday. Also, Raman touched on some really important concepts and practices to create a high-performing team in operations. So I'm probably going to point back to some of their comments as well. And I hope you guys have got some bits and pieces from these presentations. And I hope this one also helps you learn a little bit more about SRE. So before we go into the LinkedIn story, okay, just want to ask, who here knows about SRE? Who here, show of hands, who here heard about SRE or has been part of a conversation? Okay, okay. I've been asking about 50% of the room. I've been asking this question in the last 12 months, every time we engage with the community in every event, and this number has been going up. Not surprisingly, we've had a few SRE talks or SRE conversations at this event. It's happening all over the world. There is a high interest in the DevOps community about site reliability engineering. Okay, we're going to see why this is happening, and we're going to see why it makes a ton of sense for any company embarking in a DevOps journey or just trying to make the dev and the ops teams work together, why it makes sense to know a little bit about SRE and to use some of those patterns and practices to actually to make those teams come together and to accomplish the goal that everyone has to ship faster, to drive customer innovation faster. Okay? All right. Again, before the LinkedIn story, we're going to take a quick look at some basic concepts around SRE. I'm not going to extend myself since half of the room have heard of SRE, but just want to make sure that we are all on the same page with some of the basic concepts, some of the foundational concepts. SRE started at Google, and we are all very complimentary for the way Google handled. They built the practices, they documented the practices, and they shared the practices out with the broader community. We're all very complimentary of their engineering ability, and of course, with the the overall attitude of sharing these practices with the community. The site reliability book is really the foundation for site reliability, and it's definitely mandatory reading for anyone trying to learn more. The team recently launched, earlier this year, they launched what they call the SRE workbook with more practical advice for companies other than Google that are trying to implement some of these patterns and practices inside their own environment. But the beginning of SRE was a long time ago, 2003. Google was going through a phase of hypergrowth, right? It was the time where Google was becoming really, really global. There was a boom in terms of traffic, in terms of user interaction, in terms of infrastructure as well. And that was the time where Google realized that they couldn't manage their infrastructure or grow their operations team in a traditional way or in a linear way. They needed a different approach to manage IT operations to be able to create a company, essentially a global online services company, right, with the volume, with the number of users, with the global reach that Google had at that time, right? So Google hired an engineer called Ben Trainers-Loss. He became essentially the first person, or the person who defined some of the principles of what we call SRE today. And if you ask him what is the definition of SRE, that is his definition. It's what happens when you ask a software professional, a software engineer, to design an ops team, right? We're going to see what that means. We're going to look at 3 basic concepts of SRE that essentially provide an explanation for that. I personally prefer, there are many definitions out there. You can pick your own definition, or you can make your own definition. I personally prefer one definition that was given to me by David Blank-Edelman. It's another leader in the SRE space. He's now part of our team, but he was one of the founders. He's one of the founders of the SRE Con, and he is also a published author on SRE. Before he joined our team, he provided the definition that I like the most, which is SRE is an engineering discipline designed to remove failure out of a system and bring that system to the level of reliability that you desire. There are several keywords. It's a long definition. There are several keywords there. Engineering discipline is definitely an important element of SRE. We're going to see why, right? Designed to remove failure, to automate failure out of a system. There's another important element in that definition. And bring that system to the level of reliability that you desire. Note that I didn't say bring that system to perfect reliability or to 100% reliability. That is really expensive. 100% reliability is virtually unattainable, and it's not productive. Trying to reach that perfect reliability is not only expensive, but it mobilizes too many resources inside your team, inside your company. Resources that could be actually used to improve time to market, could improve processes and tools inside your company to push features, new features to your customers that are now basically dedicated to make that reliability go 3 nines, 4 nines, 5 nines, right? The other reason why we didn't say perfect reliability is because very few systems in the real world actually need to operate at that 100% reliability. So when I'm flying back to the US tomorrow, I definitely want that airplane to operate at 100% reliability, right? If you have a pacemaker, right, you want that device, that system to operate at 100% reliability. But I guarantee that most of the systems that you touch, that we touch collectively, don't need to operate at that level. especially because most of the dependencies around those systems don't come even close to 100% reliability. And those dependencies have a big impact on the user experience. So if you take a mobile app, for example, right, there are so many dependencies around that customer experience, right, that if you try to design a back end or a front end that operates at 100% reliability, do you think the mobile device, do you think the carrier, do you think the data transmission will actually provide the same level of reliability? Probably not. So we're going to see how SRE addresses this, essentially this reality, and helps optimize, helps balance the need for reliability, the need for a great customer experience, with the need for innovation, for speed, for time to market, okay? Is Google the only company doing SRE? Of course not, otherwise we will not be here talking about how LinkedIn is doing SRE. But there is a lot of companies across the globe. This is just, you know, just a sample. Companies that are implementing SRE patterns and practices internally. The important thing here, I think for everyone to understand, if you don't take anything else out of this presentation, take this. SRE, just as a term or as an acronym, right, it's not important in itself. What's really important are the patterns and practices for modern IT and cloud operations that are introduced by SRE. Every company will adopt, will follow different patterns and practices. Maybe the principles that Google established are actually applicable to everyone, and the principles are really, really universal, right? But the practices will be different. Your company is different than Google, right? Most likely, unless you are Google. And which means your practices will be different. You adopt different practices in a different timeline with different priorities, and the culture is different as well. So just a word of caution, right? Everything that you read about SRE, read with a critical eye, in the same way you do with DevOps, right? DevOps, we consider SRE and DevOps have a really strong connection. They try to accomplish the same things. They try to help companies launch new features faster, and they help dev, ops, and product to work together, right? To create virtual cycles, to create fast feedback loops, right? And they come from just a different perspective. The problem space is different, and SRE is a little bit more prescriptive, right? But everything that you read about SRE, read with a critical eye. It doesn't mean it's not a religion. You know, you're not going to go to hell if you don't follow one of the principles and practices, okay? Two really great resources for companies, essentially, that are not Google, right? I recommend, if you want to know how other companies are implementing SRE internally, I recommend Seeking SRE, written by David Blank Edelman, the gentleman that I mentioned before. And for smaller organizations, there is a really cool ebook written by Jason Hand, who is also in our team. We're very fortunate to have a very strong SRE practice inside Microsoft. So when Jason was working for VictorOps, which is a SaaS company that provides a tool in the incident management space, he was essentially the engineering lead for SRE internally, and he documented their entire experience. Okay, so it's a really cool ebook, and you can just download and learn from it. Okay? Okay, I mentioned that we're going to talk about three basic concepts. Again, just to bring everyone on the same page before we jump into the LinkedIn story. What characterizes SRE? What is unique about SRE? How is SRE different than just traditional IT operations? There are some principles behind it, okay? The first one is that SRE as a group, the SRE organization, believes that operations is a software problem. Fundamentally, SRE, the SRE team, looks at the issues and problems in the operations space from a completely different perspective, right? It requires a different mindset. It requires the mindset of someone who doesn't want to keep doing things manually. Requires the mindset of someone who wants to automate things. Requires the mindset of someone who is able to code, right? To program a computer to do something that was before done by humans, right? So yes, the SRE organization can code. They can build tools. Does it mean that the entire SRE organization is formed by developers? No, it doesn't mean that the entire organization is formed by developers and you don't need IT operations anymore. It means that the SRE organization has a broader set of skills than just your traditional IT operations organization. And the mindset is different. The way the SRE organization looks for permanent engineering solutions for problems in the IT operations space is quite unique. And it's usually not seen in traditional IT ops teams. SRE works to automate toil away. Toil is defined by manual tasks, repetitive tasks, that are usually triggered by a ticketing system, very transactional in nature, and they are devoid of enduring value. They don't bring long-term value to the organization. There's always going to be toil every time. I mean, we manage systems, we manage complex systems. There is always going to be manual work to be done in IT operations. The key here is to understand that and to limit the amount of toil that your SRE engineers actually, the amount of time they spend with toil, with manual activities. In the case of Google, they capped the time their SRE team spends with toil, with manual activities, at 50%, okay? So they created a structure, and basically what dictates the rotation is the on-call schedule. So if you are an SRE engineer at Google, you may be on call for an entire week, and then the next week you are not on call. Or maybe you are, you can maybe support a team on call, but you are not carrying the pager. You're not gonna be interrupted. And why this is important? It's important because the time that you're not using to do manual activities, to toil, is a time that you need to use to do projects. Projects that increase the reliability of the environments. That is the time that you use to better document your infrastructure, to better automate your infrastructure, to code, to create applications, to create tools, to create, or essentially do the engineering work that characterizes SRE, okay? SRE, I think it's, even in the Google book, SRE is maniacal about removing toil from the entire picture. As Roman mentioned before, not all automation is intelligent. It has to be done with judgment, of course. But in general, what we see in the traditional IT operations organizations is that there is a lot that can be automated. And the job cannot be defined by someone who spends 100% of their time just doing manual tasks driven by a ticketing system in a reactive way. The third principle, it may be more important if you really want to know if your organization is implementing SRE or SRE practices. Two really important concepts: the concept of service level objective and the concept of error budget. Service level objective is nothing else than just a reliability goal for your service, right? I mentioned before that very few services need to have 100% reliability. So why is the right reliability goal for your service, right? That's a difficult question to answer. And it's not answered only by SRE. It's also not answered uniquely by the dev team or by the product team, right? This is the tricky part of defining, you know, getting the teams to work together. This is the first step of implementing SRE in an organization, is making sure that those three teams, ops, dev, and product, have clarity around what is important for our end users and what is the reliability goal that delivers that customer experience. We're not going to have, as a reliability goal, things like percent of processor utilization or percentage of disk space or something like this. Those metrics are important at the server management level. What we're talking about here, service level objective or reliability goal for a service, are the things that matter to our end users, are the things that are going to impact the customer experience. Availability, most of the time, is one of those indicators, but there may be other things that are important to your users. The error rate, or the correctness of the answers. There are many other things, right? Maybe latency, right? And there may be even some, I would say, more native customer experience metrics or even some business-related metrics that may be considered in the service level objective, okay? Getting into an agreement with dev and product about what are the few metrics, by the way, when defining service reliability goals for your, or reliability goals for your service, choose a manageable number. It's a few, it's not a lot. Otherwise, it becomes impossible to manage, right? Those are the very few indicators that are really important for your user, right? Getting to an agreement, it's almost like getting to a contract, right? Gets everyone on the same page about what is important for our user. Has a lot to do with DevOps, getting the teams to talk, get the teams to agree on the priorities, get the teams to agree on joint metrics, right? On joint execution priorities. So this is really well aligned with DevOps. So let's say now that you and the dev team, your team, the dev team and the product leaders agree that the reliability that you desire for your service is 95%, for example. What does it mean? All right, so this is the reliability goal. What is that 5% between 100 and 95 give us? That is the error budget. The error budget is the difference between perfect reliability and our reliability goal. And what do we do with that budget? We do what we do with any budget. We spend it, okay? We spend it. So after you define a reliability goal and after you are able to monitor your reliability goal according, to, weekly or monthly or quarterly, right? You have a trusted way to monitor that reliability goal. You can start looking at error budget. And the concept here is because there is an agreement about our reliability, the reliability for our service is at 95%. Anything above that, the user is probably not noticing. Anything below, yeah, we don't want to get that. So our 5% budget dictates the time that we have, the ability that we have to keep pushing innovation, keep pushing new features to production, essentially. So the overall concept here is, while we are within the error budget, the dev team has green light to launch, right? Assuming we have an automated process in place, assuming we have all the quality metrics and the test metrics in place, right? We have our CI/CD pipeline with test and quality metrics automated. But the overall concept is dev can launch. We can push innovation to our users. As the error budget, we get closer to the error budget, right? If we launch something that affects the reliability and we fall under the reliability goal, we exceed our error budget, what do? Typically, organizations need to make a decision. Every organization is different. Not all organizations can actually stop a release or can stop launching features. But in general, when we exceed our error budget, it's time to maybe release less often or stop releasing new features. It's time to reprioritize the time or to reprioritize or bring new engineering priorities, focus on increasing reliability, or it's time to roll back and go look at what were the issues that our last updates created in the production environment, right? In general, it's a time where the company agrees to stop and look back and increase reliability for those features, right? When we reach that level of reliability desired, agreed between ops or SRE, dev, and product, the dev team is, basically ready to launch again. So that is how SRE and the dev teams and the product teams find the balance between reliability and innovation, okay? And again, this is a central concept in SRE. Pretty much every organization who implemented SRE will talk about SLOs, service level objectives, and error budgets. It's the contract between the teams, okay? All right. Before we jump into the LinkedIn, I'm just gonna open up any questions, any comments. Have you guys heard of SLOs, error budgets? It's a new concept. Does it make sense? Goes against DevOps, aligns with DevOps. We're all good for now? Mm-hmm. Mhm. Every company is different, and SRE does not prescribe how you do that, but SRE essentially says that you absolutely have to have all those checks and balances in place. So let's say that your dev team is, adopting DevOps practices. You have a pipeline established. You have your test strategy, and you have all the triggers, right, for the code to move through your pipeline. SRE is not going to do anything different. SRE is probably going to integrate with that, and if nothing else, complement. We're going to see the example with LinkedIn. So SRE does not prescribe, but SRE definitely recommends, or it's a basic condition, right, for a code to get into the production, that the quality and reliability was built in across the entire software life cycle. Right, so that. Oh, you measure in production, but you need to measure across the entire software life cycle, right? But those metrics are in production. You really focus on that reliability goal and the error budget. In terms of the customer experience, what they are, the software that they are experiencing right now. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. No, you're absolutely right. Canary deployment is one of the strategies. LinkedIn uses canary deployment, right? And of course you have a set of metrics on the canary, right? And then you see what's happening there, right? And if you see something that doesn't look right, don't push it. Don't push the cluster, right? Don't push the broader cluster, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's not. It's yeah. Then that's a limitation of the canary strategy, right? Again, SRE doesn't change some of the challenges that exist today, but it creates a framework for ops or for SRE, dev, and prod to agree on key metrics. And there is actually quite a bit on the SRE materials about measuring, where you're going to put the measurement to see that data, right? Let's go through the LinkedIn case study, and I'd like to introduce you to Ben Ferguson. Of course, he's not here, but Ben is the leader of the SRE organization at LinkedIn. He's actually leading the SRE tools team, and we're going to see why this team is important. I like to say that he is the chief storyteller for LinkedIn, even though that's not his job title, of course. But what he did was, when he joined LinkedIn, and it was around the time they decided to implement SRE, his team did a phenomenal job documenting not only the challenges that they were facing with the infrastructure, with the release process, in working with other teams, but also the SRE journey, the same journey that we're talking about here. They did a really good job. So they created a series of blog posts. You can look for it online, or you can, if you go to my Twitter feed, my first tweet, my pinned tweet, actually has a link for this series. It's a great piece of content for ops teams and dev teams alike. It's full of lessons, and they really go deep into some of the challenges, some of the issues, measurement and quality, and how to promote certain things, and things that went wrong, and how they learned the things that went wrong. So full of lessons. I definitely recommend you guys to look it up. The LinkedIn story, again, similar to Google, right? It starts in 2010. LinkedIn was going through a hyper-growth stage, and if you remember, think about 2010, social networks, of course, were becoming a big deal. Most of the major networks were getting a lot of users, or having explosive growth, but the scenario wasn't clear. It wasn't very clear if which network would serve to each purpose, right? So people are still confused. Should I add my professional information on my Facebook? Should I post personal things on LinkedIn? What do I do with Twitter? And so at that time, there was a competitive pressure to launch a lot of new features. So the business was under a lot of pressure to launch new features. The teams, dev and ops, were operating at a very traditional model. So dev had responsibility for the code. The application was never a monolith, but it was a lot more monolithic than it is right now. So they had ownership for the code. When they had a release ready to go, they would just throw over the fence or the wall. The ops team would catch, and then they would be responsible without knowing much about the application or the architecture or the code or details. Their responsibility was just to keep that code running, to deploy and keep the code running. The release scheme was, the release branch was very complex. They had branches for the next release, for future releases. So you could check your code in a future release, but not in the next release. And then all sorts of complexities, which made merge very difficult, which of course lowered the reliability of the releases. So at the same time, they were growing very fast, and they were having a lot of troubles to keep the site up. So during this time, the LinkedIn leadership decided to, of course, they needed to speed up the software development process, which, by the way, each release was happening around every other week. So every 2 weeks, a new release. And it was a big deployment. It was essentially the traditional concept of a big release being deployed in production, right? Replacing the previous release. So the leadership decided that this approach just didn't work anymore. They wanted to get into a more agile DevOps cadence, and they decided that for ops, that SRE was the right framework to essentially reset the approach. So at the same time, the dev team was kind of embracing DevOps. The ops team started embracing SRE. They thought those two frameworks were a great way to get these two teams on the same page in terms of how to increase essentially the agility for the organization. This was great. First of all, having executive sponsorship is phenomenal. It's not always that we actually see that, right? So the company, very important for the company, right? In many cases, we see the executive sponsorship happening as maybe the last step after the teams worked it out together, after the teams, had the first few quick wins, after the results showed up, and then the leadership comes and provides that broader support. But just highlights the importance of securing executive support for something big like this. Another really important thing that they did, they defined principles. When they decided that they were going through this journey, they defined principles. And the principles are important because when the difficult decisions need to be made, right, the team needs to go back and see what are our principles, right? What is going to guide our decisions. In the case of LinkedIn, the 3 principles for the SRE team were the following. Site up, really critical for the team. Again, LinkedIn is an online service. If the site's not up, the company is not working, right? There is no product, there is no customer experience, there is no revenue, right? And coming from a time where reliability was a problem, they were having a lot of outages. We're going to see some of the numbers that they were having. There was a level of complacency within the operations teams. So when they pressed the reset button, when they created the SRE team, the first thing that they wanted was to inject a culture of site up, which is essentially refusing to accept outage as normal. Right, the site has to be up, otherwise there is no business. The company is not working, it's not up, it's not open. The second principle was empower developer ownership, and this had essentially 2 different angles. The first one is that along the lines of site up, everyone in the company is responsible to keep the site up, is responsible for reliability, right? The concept of I finish my code, I throw over the fence, and then ops has to figure it out. Clearly, it doesn't work. It doesn't work for anyone, but it wasn't working for LinkedIn. So they wanted to infuse a level of ownership and responsibility in the dev teams as well for reliability. Again, the focus on the customer experience, right? The second angle was, that was the moment that the SRE team made a commitment to the dev team that they were going to support their agile and DevOps journey, right? So the SRE team would operate in a modern mindset according to the principles that we we discussed in the beginning of the presentation, right? To enable, to facilitate the process of launching features faster. And third, last but not least, operations as an engineering problem. Clearly, the operations team, now becoming the SRE team, needed to acquire new skills, need to develop a different mindset, and needed to operate in a different level essentially with an engineering mindset to find permanent solutions for their operations problems. I mentioned that they started in 2010. This is their journey. This is how they describe their journey, right? It may sound familiar with, companies or teams that went through their DevOps journey. You may be surprised to know that they consider they are just now transitioning from the partner to the engineer. We're going to look at each one of these phases, but just shows everyone that, again, it doesn't happen overnight. You don't buy SRE. You don't open a box and install SRE. You don't download and get SRE up and running. Just like DevOps, right? It's a set of principles and practices, and it takes a lot of time, and it's a journey, right? That's why we are exploring their journey. Okay. So let's go over each one of these phases. I think you may find you may relate to some of these journeys, and you may see where you and your company are in the journey. Again, also very well connected with DevOps here. Of course, when they started the team, the first thing that happened was new roles and responsibilities, but behaviors don't change overnight. So, and they had a lot of reliability problems on the site. So what was exactly the day-to-day there? They call the Firefighter, right? What characterizes this phase is chaos, right? They were going, again, massive growth, site with lots of reliability issues. They were going through a very tough time. So just to share a few metrics here, at the time, they had what they call the 6 a.m. shifts. So this means all engineers that were on call had to be on site at the company in the Bay Area, with laptops ready to go, their coffee on the side, because the website would essentially go down, degrade, and sometimes, or most of the time, crash between 7 and 10 a.m. They knew this was going to happen every single day of the week. So the engineers had to be there at 6 a.m. to keep the site up, and to, clearly not a very popular moment in the story of this team. They needed to get out of this stage, of course. During this stage, which, by the way, was almost 2 years in this phase, the MTTR, the mean time to recover for their outages was 1,500 minutes. 1,500 minutes is more than 24 hours. That was the average, the mean time to recover. And the number of outages was so big that if they lined up the outages perfectly, there will be, during this time, there will be an outage every second of every minute, of every hour, of every day for an entire year. So it's a pretty difficult situation for the team, right? Pretty bad situation. So how did the team turn it around? Again, the three things that the team really focused on this time was, again, they were fighting for their life, right? Clearly. There was no slack here. It was toil 100%, and everyone, all hands on deck. But they had to create a structure. They had to create a ways to get out of that mode. The first one had to do with the site-up culture. It's more like a cultural thing. The team really worked to change that mindset. But operationally, what they did that made a big difference, there are two things. The first one, Roman mentioned, what gets measured gets fixed. They realized that they didn't know what was actually broken in the first place or how to find the things that were broken. So they invested quite significantly in building a monitoring and alerting foundation. Okay, SRE requires a strong monitoring and alerting foundation. By the way, DevOps also does, right? So they built that system and for the first time they were able to see, to have telemetry essentially for the applications and for the infrastructure. They didn't stop there. They created a layer, they created a BI layer to expose that information to the entire company. So they created a self-service system for the dev teams to pull all the metrics that they could from the applications running or from basically the entire software life cycle, right? That monitoring infrastructure played a very important role, and the fact that they involved dev and product in defining these metrics and defining or making sure the metrics were accurate was really important, because if people don't believe in the data, if they don't believe in the telemetry, there's no good. There's no way you can automate things based on data, or you can actually use that data to drive change. The second thing that they did here was essentially the automation, right? Everything that was done through scripts or anything that required kind of human interaction, they tried to drive a first level of automation, right? If it was done by a checklist, they built a script. If it was done by a script, they built an app, and so on. The idea here was to save time, and they were able to stabilize the site to a certain level and save time. And that was essentially what took them to the second stage they call the Gatekeeper. This is more like for academic completeness. LinkedIn actually accidentally avoid this stage. This stage usually in most companies is when you are able to stabilize the site. Most companies, most IT operations teams will build a wall around the site. And it's usually a human wall, and that creates conflict across the team. So many companies are able to get out of the firefighter stage. They get to the Gatekeeper, but then they create a human wall around the site to protect the site from them, anyone else, right? And they fall into the trap that, okay, let's not introduce change anymore because now it's stable. LinkedIn avoided this, first of all, because it goes against the principle number 2, empower developer ownership. Clearly is not the right thing to do. Clearly they wanted to launch faster, right? They didn't want to isolate the applications. And second, because they were outnumbered. At the time, they had approximately 41 developers for every SRE. Google prescribes about 10%, so like a recommended ratio at Google is around 1 SRE for every 10 developers, right? So there was no way that the team, the LinkedIn team, the SRE team was going to build a human wall around the site. So they accidentally avoided this. What they could do, they could actually start building tools. They brought some people with coding skills. They partnered with 1 or 2 dev teams that understood the message, that were maybe further along in their DevOps journey. And the SRE team took ownership for the build system, for the entire CI/CD pipeline and build system. So instead of just automating their infrastructure and staying within their domain, they partnered closely with the dev teams and took ownership for the software, basically the infrastructure for software lifecycle. And that was essential. That essentially brought the team to this phase that they call the advocate. That essentially created the first quick wins. What this stage basically is characterized for is for the ability to rebuild relationships that were damaged before by the firefighter and the gatekeeper. 2 phases that are essentially defined by human conflict, right? At this stage, the team is becoming more like an engineering team. There is placement. SRE is now placed co-located with dev teams. They also follow that 1 or 10% guidance from Google. So there are some key dev teams inside LinkedIn at this stage that have SRE resources allocated to them. These SRE resources, they know how to code. They understand the infrastructure. They have ownership for the tooling, for the software development tooling. I'm sure you can relate to your experience, right? If you have someone at that point, of course you are going to work on a daily basis. You're going to talk, you're going to interact. If that person knows how to code, that person is going to ask smart questions about your code, maybe even look into your code. The level of interaction that happened here was much, much higher than they had before with the traditional IT operations approach and the traditional wall, right? The teams that were operating with that level, with that structure, they were essentially shipping services. The services that were coming out of those teams had a better customer experience and they were more reliable, right? And this was when essentially the SRE caught fire, if you will, internally at LinkedIn. Because of the results that those teams were actually showing, were having, Every other team, every single team that didn't want to have anything to do with SRE before, because maybe they didn't want to waste time or because they needed to make an investment, now they were screaming to actually work in that mode, right? To partner with SRE, to have SRE teams inside their structure. This is the moment where the engagement becomes proactive. It's the first time that you see the word proactive showing up here in their experience, right? Proactive means things are discussed and decided much earlier in the life cycle. This is where you shift left to include reliability in the new releases, in the new software design, in the new applications, right? There was a situation here that's, I think it's a good illustration. There was one dev team that was going to have a offsite to discuss the architecture for a new service. And the SRE team was in the room, or the SRE resources dedicated to that team. They were in the room, and there was a live site, and their first reaction was actually to leave and to go, see what was going on and to help. It was a very serious live site issue. The dev lead, or the engineering lead, pretty much said, no, that's not the right thing to do. I'm going to send some developers to take a look at what's going on, and you guys are going to stay here, because today is the day that we're going to define the architecture for this new service, this new application. If we don't embed reliability right now, it's not a Band-Aid. We cannot just, after that, go after and change everything, right? So this signals to a culture change. This signals to the partnership reaching a level where essentially they call the partner, right? Where many companies want to be, where you see examples in the Google materials, SRE materials as well, where the roles and responsibilities are becoming very similar, right? The dev team now understands components of the infrastructure, which, by the way, it's mostly software it's infrastructure as code. The SRE team, because of their dev skills and because of their ownership of the software development and the CI/CD pipeline infrastructure, knows a lot about the application and the code, right? And the partnership yields much better products. That takes us to the last phase, the engineer, and that's where they consider they are getting into. And essentially what characterizes this stage is that they're all engineers. Engineers of different stripes, right? But they're all engineers. This is where they can do things like they can mix the on-call rotation, right? They can do joint system architecture discussions. They can do joint code reviews discussions. So the SRE team is an integral part of the dev teams, and this becomes the default way for the company to operate, to build new product teams, essentially, development teams, okay? Just to wrap up, some market data. The team believes they are doing well from the user perspective, which is what matters the most for LinkedIn. This is market data from Business Insider. It's a research across across the top social networks, across some very meaningful categories. They are not all influenced by SRE or dev, but because they have a customer focus and they work in a product-centric way, right? They feel that they are able to influence results like this. They provide a platform that's meaningful and trusted by their own users, right? So they're pretty happy with what they've seen. To finalize, if you think SRE is something interesting to learn and to use in your companies or in with your customers, right? I shared some resources. Definitely start with some of the books that you saw, not only my presentation, but yesterday, more people recommended those books. The SRE community is just getting started, right? Just getting started. There is a lot of interest in the DevOps community. You see SRE conversations in any DevOps Days events these days, but the conversation is happening online as well. It's a very new and very inclusive community. So if you are interested, I can point you to some of the places where you can connect and participate. The SRE Con, the conference, is a big it's a center of gravity for this community. So if you have a chance to attend or join their Slack or participate in some of their online activities, it's just a great way to get to know people and to join the community. Look for compelling reasons inside your company. Nobody goes through the DevOps journey or the SRE journey just because, I have time and it sounds like it's a fun thing to do. They go because things are hard and things are, things need to improve, right? So think about why LinkedIn went through this journey. It was almost like a survival journey for them, right? Maybe it's not necessarily for your company, but if you don't find compelling reasons from a business perspective, it becomes really hard to have this conversation internally. Remember, monitoring and alerting is foundational, both for DevOps and SRE. If the data is not trusted, the data is not good. And without the data, you cannot really automate your way out of toil, out of manual tasks, right? The data is critical to build an automated software life cycle and to build an operational efficient infrastructure in an automated way. Learn about what's happening in your infrastructure. Incident reports, blameless incidents reviews are very important. Play with SLOs, service level objectives and error budgets. Even if before you even establish SLOs and error budgets for your service, check what are the numbers today, for your service, for your applications, right? That usually is a good way to start the conversation with product owners and with development teams. And after all that, or if you're lucky enough, like the LinkedIn team, or maybe earlier, secure management support, because throughout this entire journey, management support was essential. Otherwise, you just can't get, things like I mentioned before, the SRE team staying in the room during a software review when there is a live site issue happening, right? That shows a team that has executive support that can actually can say no and can make the right decisions regardless, okay? If you are curious about how Microsoft is actually using SRE, Microsoft runs several online services at scale, including Azure. We have a few links here. We have actually a SRE 101 training, and we just coming out of our Ignite conference. There was an SRE track, so there were 4 or 5 sessions related to the topics of SRE and incident management, so you can find the sessions here online. And if you are playing with Azure and if you want to maybe use Apps Insights or Azure Monitoring to start building your monitoring infrastructure, you can just DM me and I have a credit that I can provide. Doesn't require a credit card, by the way. This pass you don't need to provide a credit card. Okay, thank you. I think that's pretty much it. I'm over, so I apologize for being over, but thank you for staying, and I'll be here answering questions if you guys want to have any questions, okay?